Hello, my name is Caroline Stout, and this is my final exegesis project for Theological Inquiry, and I will be discussing Luke 11, verses 34 through 36. My major points are as follows. My first point, I'll discuss the context, including the intended audience and the theological and philosophical context of the time. My second point, I will compare the same passage in the book of Matthew and the book of Luke. And my third point, I will discuss the modern application of Luke 11:34 through 36. In this section, I will discuss the philosophical and theological context of Luke chapter 11, verses 34 through 36, and the time that it was said by Jesus and written by Luke. Understanding the philosophical and theological context is important because biblical authors brought their own preconceived notions to the text, which are then exchanged with an audience that may have a similar or drastically different philosophical or theological background. The symbology of the eye. Betts points out on page 442 of his article that the Jewish contemplation of the eye ought to be considered in order to enter into deeper interpretations of its implications. The eye is one of the strongest symbolic images today. This was also the case in the first century historical context. Considering earlier traditions of sense perception and cognition as metaphors necessitates the assumption that the debate and discussion of this subject had, as stated by Betts on page 442, entered into Jewish circles. Betts acknowledges on page 442 that influence of this kind was typical of Hellenistic Judaism, so I believe that this is a safe assumption to explore. Betts argues on page 448 that Jewish discussion of sense perception is in response to Hellenism and its influences. Jewish consideration of the functioning of the eye is just a part of what Betts calls the great confrontation between Judaism and Hellenism. So why is the intersection of first century Hellenistic and Judaism thought on sense perception and cognition significant in exegeting Luke chapter 11 verses 34 through 36? Betts points out on page 442 that the passage presented in both Matthew 6:22 through 23 and Luke 11:34 through 36 is a good example of what he calls the great confrontation between Judaism and Hellenism. If we follow the assumption that Jewish discussion of sense perception and cognition is a response to Hellenism and its influences, then, similar to Greek thought, the Jewish contemplation of eye function would start with the same proverbial imagery that was current at the time and cross-cultural in scope, as Betts points out on page 442. In this section, I will discuss the prominent Greek thinkers that have content that relates to the subject matter that's presented in Luke 11:34 through 36. A metaphorical definition with regards to the human eye occurs as early as Pythagoras, who called the eye the gates of the sun. Pythagorean philosophical tradition also contained the metaphorical dichotomy of light versus dark, which is significant to the passage. Heraclitus' tradition also included sayings containing discussion of the eyes. Betts points out on page 443 that two of his sayings are particularly significant. One discusses preference of vision over auditory sense perception. He says, "The eyes are more accurate witnesses than the ears." The other saying by Heraclitus is critical of both vision and auditory sense perception. It says, "Bad witnesses are eyes and ears to men if they have barbarian souls." If barbarian souls means the men do not comprehend that which they perceive, then Heraclitus would not be doubting the value of the sense of perception itself, but rather the men who do not use their organs with consideration, according to Betz. Parmenides, like Pythagoras, discusses the dualism of light versus dark. Betz points out that this dichotomy was preeminent in his cosmology and epistemology. In Parmenides' tradition, light was equated with truth, and darkness was equated with ignorance or non-being. Empedocles presents the first comparison of eyes to a lamp. In his poem, Empedocles compares vision to a man using storm lamps to go out on a winter evening. In this section, I will discuss the relevance of the context to Jesus' message. In chapter 11 of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is teaching to crowds that contain a wide variety of people. These people are both interested in his ministry or uncommitted or neutral. He is teaching his disciples and, quote, crowds that formed around him. Luke points out that these crowds consisted of many types of people with diverse backgrounds. The crowds ranged from women to the religious elite of the time. Jesus, if addressing the Pharisees in the crowd as well as his Jewish followers, would be speaking with the expectation these Jewish religious leaders would have understanding of common Hellenistic and Jewish theories and thought of the time. Betz supports this point by emphasizing on page 442 that debate and discussion of sense perception and cognition as metaphors was, quote, widespread in the circles of philosophers and theologians at the time of the New Testament, end quote. Jesus may be offering a contribution to ongoing philosophical and theological discussion of the time, in addition to his instruction on moral living. I will now discuss how Luke's message might differ from that of Jesus's. Jesus, as portrayed by Luke's account, is teaching. Through instruction, Jesus wants to communicate a moral standard. Luke, however, is writing to communicate a past event to an audience distanced temporally or perhaps even culturally. The Gospel of Luke is written to a man named Theophilus, which means lover of God. It is believed by many scholars that Theophilus is a new believer that was most likely a Gentile. So Luke was addressing a more Gentile audience potentially. So it follows that Luke may be writing to an audience that would not be as apprised of the nuances of first century Jewish or even Hellenistic theology and philosophy. Therefore, I believe that Luke is aiming to retell a past event and provide moral instruction to fellow believers. Now, in this section, I'll compare Matthew 6:22 through 23 to Luke 11:34 through 36 using a synoptic comparison. Matthew and Luke present two different versions of the same passage. While the subject matter is the same, the word choices made present significantly different theologies between Matthew and Luke. So there are a few differences in pronouns and articles affecting the distance of the tone, in that the tone might seem more general or broad, or it could seem more pointed and directed at the individual. For example, Matthew says, the eye, which has a more general or conceptual tone, while Luke says, your eye, which has a more personal or directed tone. These differences, though, have little to no bearing on the theologies presented by Matthew and Luke respectively. I think that they are more influenced by the intended audiences. Matthew presents an observation, though, that there is a possibility of a dark light within. In verse 23, he says, but if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. Betz points out that there is no point of preventability of that moral failure. I think that lack of preventability lies in the verb will be full of darkness. However, I would argue against Beth's interpretation because that state of being full of darkness is dependent on the if right here. So if your eye is evil. I noticed in reading Matthew 6:22 through 23 that there is a repetition of a condition, if therefore. So if therefore your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. So there is an if then statement. There is a cause and effect. The cause, if your eye is single or healthy or single in purpose, then your whole body will be full of light. Then verse 23, but if your eye is evil, evil and evil by eye being the cause, the effect is your whole body will be full of darkness. Then the condition, if therefore the light which is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Betts discusses that Luke's version, on the other hand, presupposes that a dark light is the result of moral failure and that one can prevent that moral failure. I see his point in the verse 35 that starts with, watch therefore lest the light which is in you be darkness. I see the possibility of preventability in that because there is a warning. Therefore, that implies that there's a possibility that someone does watch to prevent that darkness. However, I see a lack of preventability by the word when. So when your eye is single, that implies that there is not a possibility of an eye not being single. Similarly to when it is evil. But when it is evil, your body is also full of darkness. I see here that there is a dichotomy where some people may be presented with a preventability or a lack of preventability, but when it is evil. You cannot prevent when your eye is evil. But then Luke kind of summarizes the passage in verse 36. It says, if therefore your body is full of light, not having any dark part, it will be wholly full of light, as when the lamp lights you up with its flash. So I think that the if therefore your whole body is full of light reinforces that there is a preventability, as Betts points out, because there is that cause and effect situation. So now I will discuss the modern application of Luke 11:34 through 36. If, like James Edwards, we view the eye as the aperture through which light or darkness enters the body, then a single or unhealthy eye that allows light into the body represents a spiritually pure or healthy way of looking at things. When we take in the world with a heavenly perspective, we will be full of light, meaning full of truth, knowledge, and righteousness. But if we have a bad or evil perspective, we will be full of darkness. According to John Carroll, one of the implications of being full of darkness is that one's eyes cannot see the evidence of Jesus' ministry. If you are full of darkness, you will not be able to fully see God's hand in your life and in the lives around you. Essentially, we must have a healthy, heavenly perspective to be truly receptive of what God is doing. When we're not receptive of His will, we will be characterized by darkness.